What if the most important decision of your life wasn't about choosing a job, or a career, or even a home? What if it was about the life you're bringing into the world and who you will have by your side when it happens? Emily S. world was about to be turned upside down. At the height of her career, she discovered she was pregnant, an unexpected twist that would change everything. But the bigger challenge was, in just the pregnancy, it was facing the truth about her relationship with Mark, the CEO she had briefly known, and now, the man who might be the father of her child. When a surprise pregnancy threatens everything she has worked for, Emily must decide continue her career and risk losing the relationship she never expected to need, or step back and embrace motherhood, uncertain about her future with a man who hasn't made any promises. If you were in her shoes, what would you choose? Join Emily on a journey of difficult choices, personal growth, and unexpected love. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Now, let us see what Emily decides. The sound of the ultrasound slipping from her fingers echoed through the quiet hallway, a sharp reminder of the fragile moment she was about to face. Emily Harris froze, her heart racing as the black and white image fluttered across the polished marble floor. Time seemed to slow as the photo glided gracefully, almost delicately, down the hallway. Her hand, still extended in an instinctive attempt to stop its descent, could only watch in helplessness as it landed softly right at the feet of Mark Rutherford, the CEO of Rutherford Enterprises. Emily stood there for a moment, breath caught in her throat. Her stomach twisted in knots, and she felt a wave of dizziness rise up from the pit of her stomach. She tried to will herself into motion, but her body refused to comply. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, louder than the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The image of the ultrasound, the very image that would change everything for both her and Mark, lay there on the floor between them. It felt as though the entire hallway had gone silent, though she knew it hadn't. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Her legs were weak beneath her, but she willed herself to move, though each step felt like an eternity. "Ms. Harris," came Marquez's deep, measured voice, shattering the silence. "I believe you dropped something." His words, though calm, sent a tremor through her chest. She felt herself flush with a hot embarrassment and dread as she looked down at the image. There was no hiding what it was. She had to pick it up. She had to face him. But there was so much more at stake now. So much more than just this awkward moment of having dropped a file or a piece of paperwork. She watched as Mark bent down gracefully, his long frame folding to retrieve the image. His Oxford shoes, polished and expensive, came into view, and for a brief moment, she found herself focusing on the gleam of them, as if it would help her delay what was coming. As he lifted the photo from the floor, she couldn't help but notice the way his fingers lingered on the corner, just a moment too long. He must have seen the date in the corner. April 15th, the date she had feared would be noticed, the date that tied her to him forever. Mark straightened, his blue eyes locking with hers, a flicker of recognition flashing across his face. His expression was unreadable, but Emily could feel the sudden weight in the air. It was as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't control. His gaze held hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and she felt exposed, vulnerable. Without saying a word, Mark extended his hand toward her, offering the photo. The silence between them was deafening, and in that instant, Emily felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the ultrasound, carefully slipping it back into her leather folder, hoping beyond hope that he hadn't made the connection. She could feel the heat of his gaze on her as she tucked the image away. The words she needed to say seemed to vanish, caught somewhere between the tangled mess of thoughts that raced through her mind. "Thank you, Mr. Rutherford," she said, forcing a polite smile. Her voice came out softer than she intended, shaky despite her best effort to sound composed. "The quarterly projections are ready for your review. I've highlighted the areas showing the most growth potential." She kept her eyes lowered, unable to meet his, as she handed him the folder with the report. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest of moments, and it sent a shiver up her spine. Mark's face remained impassive as he accepted the folder, though the intensity of his gaze never wavered. He didn't say anything right away, his eyes lingering on her face, as if reading the unspoken words that hung heavily in the air between them, a tension she could almost taste. She tried to steady her breath, her heart still thumping loudly in her chest. "Join me in my office, Ms. Harris," he finally said, his tone soft but commanding. "We need to talk." The words sent a chill through her, making her stomach twist. She nodded stiffly, her mind racing, but her body moving as though guided by a force she could not control. She followed him down the hallway, the click of her heels against the floor sounding far too loud in the silence that enveloped them. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown. The office door swung open before her, and she stepped inside, feeling the cool air of the room meet her face. The office was sleek and modern, a reflection of Mark himself, imposing, polished, and powerful. The view outside was breathtaking, the skyline of the city stretching out beneath them, but none of that mattered now. All she could focus on was the quiet storm that had been brewing ever since that night at the Bellamy Hotel, the night that had led to this moment. Mark walked past his massive desk, his eyes still fixed on her, and gestured toward the chair in front of him. His voice was low but firm as he spoke. "Please, sit." Emily did as she was told, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She sat down, her hands folding in her lap as she tried to steady herself, but the silence in the room was oppressive. The weight of the situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. Mark didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood near the window, his back to her, gazing out over the city. She could see his reflection in the glass, his strong jaw, the faint tension in his shoulders. She had never seen him like this before, so vulnerable. It was unsettling, but it also made her heart ache. She wasn't sure what to say or how to say it, and she could feel the words forming in her throat, but they refused to come out. After a moment, Mark turned around, his gaze still intense, but now there was something else in his eyes, something softer. He leaned against the edge of his desk, his posture relaxed, but his presence still commanding. It was a stark contrast to the man who had just been standing in front of her, detached and distant. "Emily," he said, his voice quieter now, as if testing the waters. "We both know why we are here, but I need to understand why you didn't tell me sooner." The weight of his question pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. She could feel the room closing in on her, the air thick with the tension of what came next. She had spent the last few weeks trying to keep this secret buried, but now there was no way out. She had to say something, had to finally face the truth. Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. She was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Emily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and finally whispered, "I didn't know how to tell you, Ms. Harris." Mark S.'s voice rang clear across the room, his tone sharp but curious. "I believe you dropped something." The words felt like a challenge, and Emily S.'s stomach turned. There was no mistaking the gravity in his voice, as if the moment held far more weight than it should have. She could feel his gaze on her, even before she turned around. It was as if the universe had conspired to make this moment stretch out, to pull her into a confrontation she couldn't avoid any longer. Her feet moved, but it was as if she were walking through quicksand. Each step took far longer than it should have. She felt as though the hallway, with its cold, pristine walls, was swallowing her whole. The whole time. The image of the ultrasound, her ultrasound, flashed through her mind. The image Mark had picked up so casually, but now everything about it seemed magnified. It was a silent message between them, one that spoke louder than words. When she finally reached Mark's office, her hand hesitated before touching the polished doorknob. It felt cold, too cold, as if it too was aware of the storm brewing just behind it. With a breath that felt like it could have shattered glass, she pushed the door open. The room greeted her in silence, but it was not the comforting silence she was used to. It was thick with tension. The air hung heavy with unspoken words, and the sound of the door closing behind her was the final curtain in a play that had already begun. She was now in the midst of something inevitable. Mark was standing by his desk, arms crossed, looking down at the folder he had just been handed. The ultrasound, still in its pristine state, had somehow become the elephant in the room. She knew that he'd seen the date, and she knew that everything had changed, though neither of them had uttered a word about it yet. For a moment, he didn't speak. His silence, though calm, felt like a storm building. Emily stood just inside the door, frozen for a second longer than necessary. Every instinct told her to run, to turn around and leave, but she couldn't. She had to face this moment, this man, this truth. "Sit down," Mark finally said, his voice smooth but firm, his gaze still fixed on her. His words were not a request, but a command. There was no room for protest. Reluctantly, Emily moved toward the chair across from him. She sat, but it was as though the chair was far too small for her now. She felt like a girl trying to fit into shoes that had long since outgrown her. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, feeling her palms begin to sweat despite the cool air in the room. Every muscle in her body was on edge, but she knew that running was no longer an option. Mark sat down behind his desk, not quite facing her, but not exactly distant either. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes never wavered from her. Emily could see the way his fingers drummed lightly against the surface of the desk, and it reminded her of how he used to do that during meetings, detached, cool, and composed. But today, something was different. His gaze was sharp, searching, as though he was trying to peel away the layers of her, one by one, until he understood everything. For a few seconds, there was no sound. The world outside the glass windows seemed to blur. All Emily could hear was the soft hum of the air conditioning, the sound of her breath, and the faint tapping of Mark's fingers. She couldn't escape the quiet tension between them. It was as though the very air in the room was pregnant with expectation. Emily knew that, somehow, everything was about to be exposed. All the lies, all the secrets, everything she had kept locked inside would have to be said now. She had no choice but to speak. Her mouth felt dry, her lips trembling slightly. She swallowed hard and finally opened her mouth. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the weight of the words as they left her mouth. But they didn't feel like they were enough. They weren't enough to explain how she had gotten here, how everything had shifted under her feet. It was a mistake, a one-time thing. The words tasted bitter. They weren't entirely true, but they were the only ones she could muster. Mark's gaze never left her, but his expression didn't shift. His eyes studied her face, tracing the lines of anxiety and guilt that crept into her features. The silence that followed was thick, more oppressive than the words she had just spoken. He leaned back in his chair, still watching her closely, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "You think this was a mistake?" Mark's voice cut through the quiet. It wasn't harsh, but the sharpness in it made her flinch. It was as if the very question held more weight than she could carry. Emily's heart began to race again. She felt cornered. "Yes," she said, though she could feel the truth twist inside her. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen." Mark leaned forward, his hands clasped together in front of him. There was a slight shift in his posture, but his eyes never wavered from hers. He had heard enough, and now it was her turn to confront him. "You think this is just something you can brush off?" "Emily, a mistake." His voice was quieter now, but the edge of disbelief was unmistakable. Emily opened her mouth, but the words failed her. She had thought she could keep this hidden, that she could manage the consequences of that one night, of the choices they had both made, but now, sitting here, she knew it was all about to fall apart. She swallowed, trying to find the words to explain the knot of emotions inside her. "I never thought it would come to this." "Mark," she said softly, her voice breaking just slightly. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, explaining myself. But here we are." Her chest tightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Mark was silent for a moment, his eyes still fixed on her. His expression was unreadable, but Emily could see the conflict simmering beneath the surface. The unease in his gaze wasn't just about the child. It was about everything, the unexpectedness of it all, the intrusion of this private moment into their professional world. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark stood up, slowly and deliberately. He took a few steps toward the window, staring out at the city below. The distance between them grew, but the tension didn't fade. It only grew stronger. "We need to talk. Emily," he said quietly, his back still to her. "This goes beyond business." The weight of his words hit her with the force of a freight train. This wasn't just about a mistake anymore. This wasn't something she could apologize for and move on from. Everything had shifted, and she was about to find out just how far-reaching the consequences were. As the door closed softly behind her, Emily felt the weight of the room press down on her. Mark sat across from her, a man who had always been composed, but now there was a flicker of something uncertain in his eyes. For the first time, she saw him not as the distant CEO or the confident business leader, but as a man vulnerable and unsure. The change in him was subtle, but it was there, hidden beneath the surface, where only she could see it. She had seen him lead meetings, calm, raging storms in his company, but in this moment, she saw a crack in that perfect facade. She swallowed hard, trying to compose herself, but the anxiety pressing on her chest made it difficult to breathe. She had been holding on to this secret for weeks, keeping it buried deep inside, but now it was all spilling out, and she had nowhere to hide. The truth was about to come crashing down. Mark S.'s eyes were fixed on her, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. Emily wished she could read him, but his gaze was impenetrable. She wasn't sure if he was angry, confused, or just as scared as she was. "Ms. Harris," he began, his voice low and controlled, "you owe me an explanation." The words were not an accusation, not exactly, but there was a weight in them that made Emily's stomach tighten. She felt the familiar rush of panic creep up her spine, but she forced herself to remain still. She had to do this. She had to face him. She couldn't keep running from this. Not anymore. She looked at him, trying to steady her shaking hands. She had thought she could keep it hidden, but one moment of carelessness had unraveled everything. The ultrasound, the one that had been tucked safely in her bag, had now become the center of everything. Mark had seen it. He had read the date, and there was no escaping the truth. Emily began, her voice faltering. It wasn't planned, Mark. It was just one night. One mistake. She hated the words as they left her mouth. They didn't feel true. It wasn't just a mistake. It had been more than that. But how could she explain it? How could she tell him that the one night they had shared in Miami had led to this moment, the life that was growing inside her, his life? Their life was a truth she hadn't been prepared to face, let alone share. Mark didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, watching her with those steady, piercing eyes. Emily couldn't look away. His silence was like a pressure, pushing down on her chest, forcing her to speak the words she had been avoiding. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not at first. I thought it was just a late period. But when I found out, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to." Her words trailed off, her voice breaking as the reality of it all began to sink in. Mark S.'s expression didn't change. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his desk. Emily could hear the sound, soft and rhythmic, but it only made the silence between them feel more pronounced. His gaze never left her, and she began to feel the weight of his scrutiny, as though he were reading her every thought. She didn't know how long they sat there in silence, but it felt like hours. Her heart raced in her chest, and she could feel the tears beginning to sting at the corners of her eyes. She had thought she could handle this. She had convinced herself that this wasn't going to change her life, that she could move forward without anyone knowing. But now, Faced with Mark S.'s calm but relentless attention, everything felt different. "Emily," Mark finally said, his voice breaking the silence. His tone was soft, but there was something else beneath it, a tremor of something he couldn't quite control. "Is this my child?" The question hit her like a tidal wave. She had known this moment would come, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. She hadn't prepared for it to sound like that, so simple, so final, and yet full of so much uncertainty. For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, and her pulse raced in her ears. She had thought she would be ready for this, but now, sitting across from him, it felt impossible. She had never imagined that this moment, this revelation, would unfold like this, that the man sitting in front of her, the CEO who ran $1 billion empire, would be looking at her, looking at the woman carrying his child like this. She had been prepared for anger, or confusion, maybe even rejection, but not this, not the quiet vulnerability in his voice. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is yours." "Mark." She saw a flicker of something pass over his face. Surprise, relief, fear. It was hard to say, but whatever it wasn't the anger she had been expecting. It was something deeper, more human. He exhaled slowly, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. For a moment, he closed his eyes, as if processing the weight of her words. The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. There was a shift in the air, a subtle change in the way they both held themselves. Emily had come here with the intention of hiding, of burying the truth even deeper. But now that it was out in the open, she felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least the first step was done. Mark opened his eyes, and his gaze softened just slightly. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his hands clasped together in front of him. There was no judgment in his expression, no anger, just the quiet acceptance that this was real. "This changes everything," he said, his voice softer now, more uncertain. "Doesn't it?" Emily nodded slowly, her breath shaky. She didn't know what to say. Everything had changed. There was no going back now. Her life, his life, their lives were all intertwined in ways they hadn't planned, hadn't foreseen. And yet, in that moment, despite all the uncertainty, there was a part of her that felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning. "I don't know what happens next," Emily whispered, her voice raw. "But I'll figure it out. We will." Mark S.'s expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like regret passing through his eyes, but it was gone before she could fully grasp it. "We'll figure it out," he repeated quietly, as if convincing himself as much as her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would. "I never thought I'd find myself here," Mark said, his voice softer now, but laced with a hidden pain. Emily looked at him, wondering just how much of his past had shaped this moment. She had known Mark as the composed, calculated CEO, the man who seemed untouchable, who ran an empire with a calm, icy demeanor. But in the softness of his voice, the way his posture shifted as he sat back in his chair, there was something that she hadn't expected, a vulnerability, perhaps a part of him that he rarely, if ever, showed. The silence stretched between them like a thick blanket, heavy and pressing. Emily couldn't quite place what had changed in the air, but she felt it a shift, subtle but undeniable. It was as though Mark had decided that this moment, this conversation, was no longer just about the baby or the future. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. "Emily," he continued, his gaze moving from hers to somewhere beyond her, as if searching for something in the distance. "There is more to this than just the business side of things. There is something I need to tell you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she could feel that it was something important. Something that might change how she saw him, perhaps... She nodded slowly, willing him to continue, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for what he was about to share. Mark took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk absently, as if gathering his thoughts. For a moment, he seemed lost in the past, his mind drifting somewhere far from the sleek office around them. I wasn't always this guarded, he said, his voice distant, almost as though he were speaking to himself. There was a time, a long time ago, when I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had a future planned, one that didn't involve these walls, or these damn boardrooms, or any of this. He gestured vaguely around the room, as though it was all part of something he couldn't quite escape. Emily leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. Mark was opening up, and she could sense that this wasn't something he did often, if ever. She had no idea what was coming, but somehow, in that moment, she knew it was something she needed to hear. I had a girlfriend once, he continued, his gaze now fixed on the polished surface of the desk. Her name was Amelia. We were young, maybe too young to know what we were doing, but we thought we had it all figured out. We talked about getting married, having kids, growing old together. We had plans. Emily, big plans. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had always seen Mark as untouchable, as someone whose life was ruled by business, logic, and control. To hear him talk about love, about the kind of future he had envisioned for himself, it was jarring, a glimpse into a side of him she had never imagined. But life, Mark's voice faltered for a moment, and Emily saw a flicker of something pain, regret, something dark that passed through his eyes. Life doesn't always give you the future you plan for, and sometimes you don't get a chance to have that happy ending. We were going to get married. We'd already started talking about kids, about settling down. But then one night, everything changed. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Emily's chest tightened as she watched him. She had never seen Mark like this before. She had always assumed he was simply a man who had built his empire from the ground up, cold and driven, never allowing anyone close enough to hurt him. But now, as he spoke of Amelia, she realized that the man before her wasn't just a successful CEO. He was someone who had loved deeply, someone who had lost everything he had ever dreamed of. She died, Mark said, his voice barely a whisper, but it hit Emily like a physical blow. She died in a car accident. One moment, she was there, and the next gone, just like that. The world doesn't wait for you to catch your breath, and it sure as hell doesn't give you any warning. That night, it broke me, and I promised myself that I wouldn't let anyone in again, not like that. Not the way I let her in. Emily's heart ached for him. She could see it now, the walls Mark had built around himself, the cold, guarded exterior that had kept everyone at arm's length. She could see how the loss of Amelia had shaped him, had turned him into the man he was today. She hadn't realized how much pain he had been carrying all this time. I thought I'd gotten past it, Mark continued, his voice quieter now, as if sharing this was somehow easier than keeping it bottled up. But I never really did. I built a life around work, around the company, because that was the only thing I could control, the only thing that didn't make me feel powerless. He finally looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, Emily saw the depth of his struggle. I was never going to let myself feel that again. I was never going to let anyone get close enough to hurt me like that. Not again. He paused, his lips pressing together in a thin line, as if the words were painful to say. And then I met you. The air between them thickened. Emily could hear her heart beating in her ears. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond. Everything she had thought she knew about Mark was shifting in front of her. He was a man who had been broken, and in some ways, he was still holding on to the pieces of that shattered past. Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands now clasped tightly in front of him. And now, I find myself in a position I never imagined. I didn't think I'd ever have to face responsibility again. I didn't think I could." He stopped mid-sentence, his voice cracking as if the words were too much to bear. Emily felt her own heart tightening as she watched him struggle with this admission. It was clear now, this wasn't just about a one-night mistake or a business decision. This was about something far deeper, something both of them were now forced to face. "I don't know if I am ready for this," he said quietly, looking at her with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. "But I don't want to run from it either." Emily's heart ached as she processed his words. She could feel the weight of it all, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty of the future. She had known that having a child would change everything, but she hadn't realized just how much it would force both of them to confront their pasts, to confront their own fears. She placed a hand on her stomach, a small, tender gesture. She had never expected to be in this position, and neither had Mark. But here they were, at the crossroads of everything they had been running from, forced to reckon with the future. "I didn't expect this either," Emily said softly, meeting his gaze. "But we need to figure this out." For a moment, Mark said nothing. But then, a small flicker of something hope, perhaps flashed in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The silence between them was thick, as if both were afraid to break it. Mark's expression was unreadable, and Emily wasn't sure what came next. Her heart was still racing from the weight of the conversation, but now there was an added layer of tension, a sense of waiting for the next move, the next word that would determine everything. She could feel the distance between them, even as they sat across from each other. It wasn't physical, no. They were closer than they had ever been, but emotionally, it felt like they were oceans apart. She glanced at Mark. His jaw was clenched, his fingers resting on the edge of the desk, tapping lightly, almost absent-mindedly. But Emily could see the unease in the way he held himself. His mind was working, turning over everything they had just talked about: the child, the future, the undeniable shift in their lives. And she understood that. She felt the same. Her thoughts were a whirlpool of uncertainty and fear. She had always prided herself on having a plan, on knowing where she was going. But now, the path ahead was unclear, and it was terrifying. Emily wanted to speak, wanted to say something to fill the silence, but nothing felt right. Words seemed so small now, so insignificant against the gravity of their situation. She wanted to reach out, to ask him for reassurance, but there was a part of her that was afraid to do so. What if his decision wasn't the one she wanted to hear? What if he wasn't as ready for this as he was pretending to be? Mark shifted in his seat, finally breaking the silence. Emily could see the hesitation in his eyes as he looked at her. But there was also something else, something that almost looked like resolve, as though he had come to a decision. But what that decision was, she couldn't yet tell. "Emily," Mark said quietly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I'm not sure how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need right now, but I know I can walk away." The words hung between them, heavy with both relief and uncertainty. Emily Wu's chest tightened. He wasn't walking away. That was something, wasn't it? But how could she know what would come next? How could she trust that things would work out, that he would be there for her when it mattered most? "I don't expect you to have all the answers." "Mark," Emily said softly, her voice tinged with both fear and hope. "I am scared too, but I don't want to do this alone." Mark's gaze softened, and for the first time since the conversation began, Emily saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He was just as scared as she was, just as uncertain about the future. And in that moment, she realized that she wasn't alone. She had been so focused on the weight of her own fears that she hadn't seen his. They were both standing at the edge of something they couldn't control, something that would change everything. But perhaps they didn't have to face it alone. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers clasped together, his eyes locked onto hers, and Emily could see the struggle in them. He was torn between wanting to help, to be there for her, and the fear that he wasn't equipped for it. But there was also something else, something she had seen earlier, something she wasn't ready to admit to herself until now. He cared. He cared more than he had let on. "I'll be there." "Emily," Mark said, his voice steady, but filled with a depth of sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. "For you and for the baby." What? The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to believe them. She wanted to believe them. She had to. The future was still uncertain, but at least for this moment, they were in this together. He wasn't abandoning her. He wasn't walking away, and that, at least, was a start. Emily nodded slowly, her throat tight, a lump forming as the emotions she had been holding back began to rise. She didn't know what the future held, and she didn't know how to navigate this new path they were both on. But one thing was clear. She wasn't alone anymore. "We'll figure it out," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at Mark, meeting his gaze, trying to find the strength in his eyes that she needed to find in herself. "We have to." Mark nodded, his expression softening. "We will," he said, though his voice carried an undertone of uncertainty, as though he were trying to convince both her and himself. For a moment, there was silence again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of before. It was more thoughtful, as though they were both taking in what had just been said. The air between them felt charged, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Mark stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. Emily followed his lead, rising from her chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She still didn't know how everything would turn out. She still had questions, fears, doubts. But for the first time in a long time, she felt as though they were facing those questions together rather than apart. "I'll be there." "Emily," Mark said again, his voice more firm this time, as though he was reaffirming the promise, making it something he would hold to. "I can promise that everything will be easy, but I promise that I want to walk away." Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. They hadn't solved anything yet, hadn't found a way to move forward. They had simply made a decision to face this together, to face the unknown with each other. But the hard part was still ahead. As Mark stepped toward the door, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were both standing at the edge of something huge, something that would define the rest of their lives. She wasn't sure if they were ready, if they were truly prepared for what was coming. But one thing was certain, they were no longer alone. She placed a hand on her stomach, a small, almost instinctual gesture, a reminder of what was at stake, of what was to come. "I didn't expect this either," Emily said softly, looking at Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to figure this out." Mark's gaze softened once more, and though he didn't say anything, the look in his eyes was all the answer she needed. They would figure it out together. Emily woke up the next morning, a wave of uncertainty settling in her chest. The decision had been made, but the real challenge was yet to come. Her eyes fluttered open, the soft light of the morning slipping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts that had been swirling in her mind since the night before. The conversation with Mark had been intense, more intense than she had ever anticipated. But now, it was time to face the reality. It wasn't just about the baby. It wasn't just about her and Mark. There was so much more at stake now, and she wasn't sure how to navigate any of it. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The coolness of the room contrasted sharply with the heat that still lingered in her chest. Her mind was a blur of thoughts, each one crashing into the next, too fast to keep up with. She thought of the conversation with Mark, the promise he had made to be there, for her, for the baby. It felt like a lifeline, but also like a heavy responsibility. Would he really be able to follow through? Would she? And what about work? Emily's mind immediately turned to the consequences of their decision. Mark had been kind enough to offer support, but the reality of it was far from simple. She was still an employee at Rutherford Enterprises. She couldn't help but wonder how everything would change when the news got out, if it ever did. Would her position at the company be questioned? Would the assumptions people made about her shift? The world outside her little bubble was a lot less forgiving, and Emily knew it. The clock on the bedside table ticked loudly in the otherwise still room, marking the passing of time she wasn't ready to face. She needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand, someone who wouldn't judge her. Sarah, her best friend since college, the one person she had always turned to when things felt impossible. Emily pulled on a loose sweater, the fabric comforting against her skin, and picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, pausing when her finger hovered over Sarah's name. She needed to talk to her. She needed advice, clarity, or maybe just a sounding board. But as her finger hovered, a wave of doubt swept over her. Would Sarah understand? Would she be disappointed? Would she think Emily had made a terrible mistake? Taking a deep breath, Emily hit dial and brought the phone to her ear. The sound of the ring felt too loud in the quiet of the morning. When Sarah answered, her voice bright and familiar, it was like a small weight lifted off Emily's shoulders. "Hey, Emily, how is everything going?" "Hey, Sarah," Emily replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I need to talk to you about something big." Sarah's tone immediately shifted, no longer casual, but full of concern. "Of course. What's going on?" Emily glanced out the window, watching as the early morning sunlight danced across the leaves. Her fingers gripped the phone tightly. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and this one felt like it was slowly suffocating her. "I am pregnant," she said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. The room felt instantly heavier, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She waited for Sarah's response, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Sarah's voice, soft but filled with surprise, came through the phone. "Oh, wow. Emily, that's huge. What are you going to do?" Emily squeezed her eyes shut, her mind racing. She had always planned everything, had always been in control of her life, or so she thought. But now, nothing was in her control. "I don't know yet," Emily admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, I've talked to Mark. He's agreed to help, but I don't know what comes next. I am scared. Sarah, I don't know how to do this." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Sarah's voice came back, steady and reassuring. "You don't have to know everything. I know this isn't what you planned, but you are not alone in this. You've got options, and you've got people who care about you. You'll figure it out." Emily felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah's words, but the uncertainty still hung in the air like a dark cloud. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm ready to change my life like this." Sarah sighed, a long, deep sound that spoke of understanding and empathy. "None of us are ever ready for big changes. But you're strong. You've always been strong, and you've got a lot of people around you who want to help." "I am here for you." "Okay, Emily." Chest tightened as she listened to her friend's comforting words. She knew that Sarah meant well, but there was still a part of her that felt so lost. She had always been the one to handle things on her own, to keep things together, but now everything felt different. The future was no longer clear, and the reality of what was coming felt overwhelming. "Thanks, Sarah," Emily whispered. I am so scared. I know, sweetie. But you're gonna be okay. Just take it one step at a time. And remember, you don't have to figure it all out today. You've got time." The conversation with Sarah didn't solve everything, but it gave Emily something she hadn't had before: perspective. Sarah was right. She didn't have to figure everything out today. She didn't have to have all the answers, just the courage to take the next step. As Emily ended the call, a strange sense of peace settled over her, but the fear was still there, lurking in the background. She had decided to face the future, no matter how uncertain it was. But there was still so much she didn't know about Mark, about the baby, about herself. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily went through the motions of work, checking emails, making phone calls, but her mind kept returning to what Sarah had said, one step at a time. Emily repeated the words silently to herself as she sat at her desk. She didn't have to solve everything all at once, but as she walked out the door at the end of the day, her mind was still clouded with doubt. Would Mark really be there? Could she really handle this? And what would her life look like now that everything had changed? The world outside felt different now, more uncertain. As she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. And though she was still scared, for the first time, Emily felt a tiny spark of hope. She wasn't alone. She wasn't in this by herself, but still, she wondered, could she really share the full truth with Sarah without feeling judged? Was she ready to let someone in, completely? Sarah's apartment was quiet, the soft hum of the coffee machine filling the space. Emily sat down, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her thoughts. The apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of vanilla candles, creating an atmosphere of calm. Yet, inside Emily, everything felt chaotic. She had arrived early, the weight of what she had to say pressing down on her chest. The thought of telling Sarah what had been happening in her life, about the baby and Mark, made her heart race. But she also knew that Sarah was the one person who would understand. She had been putting this conversation off for days, unsure of how to start. She had spent the past week running from the reality of her situation, trying to figure out how she would handle it, how she could make everything work. But now, as she sat across from her best friend, the truth had nowhere to hide. Sarah walked over from the kitchen, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to Emily, offering a warm smile that Emily didn't quite feel capable of returning. "You've been quiet all morning," Sarah said gently, setting the mug in front of her. "What's going on?" Emily felt her stomach tighten, but she couldn't delay it anymore. She needed to say it. She had to tell someone. Her eyes dropped to the mug, her fingers curling around it for some sense of grounding. I need to tell you something," Emily began, her voice shaky. Something that had been going on for a while. She inhaled deeply and forced herself to look up at Sarah, her heart pounding in her chest. "I am pregnant." Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment, her eyebrows furrowing in surprise. She sat down beside Emily, giving her the space she needed, but her eyes remained soft and open, filled with the warmth of someone who cared deeply. "Wow," Sarah said quietly. "That's a lot to take in. How do you feel about it?" Emily swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. "I am scared. I didn't expect any of this to happen, and I certainly didn't plan for it to be like this." "Tell me everything," Sarah urged, her voice calm but insistent, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. "You don't have to hide anything from me." Emily felt the weight of her words settle in, and with a deep breath, she began to tell Sarah the whole story. How she had met Mark at the Bellamy Hotel charity gala months ago, their brief but intense encounter, and how she had tried to convince herself it had been nothing more than a fleeting moment. But then came the missed period, the pregnancy test, and finally, the ultrasound that had changed everything. She told Sarah about Mark's reaction, his promise to be there for her, but the uncertainty she still felt about the future. As she spoke, Emily couldn't help but notice how Sarah was listening so intently. Her best friend didn't interrupt, didn't judge, and didn't ask questions. She simply listened, a steady presence in the midst of Emily's whirlwind emotions. When Emily finished speaking, she let out a long, shaky breath. She hadn't realized until now how much she had been carrying, how much she had kept inside. And now that it was all out in the open, it felt overwhelming. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing what Emily had just shared. Her hands wrapped around her own mug, her eyes thoughtful but kind. Then, slowly, she spoke. "Okay, so? You were pregnant? And Mark S. in the picture? But you were not sure what that means for you both. What's your gut telling you?" Emily's heart pounded at the question, And for a moment, she didn't have an answer. Her gut. What was her gut telling her? It had been so overwhelmed by the noise of everything around her that it was hard to hear her own instincts. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel lost. I feel like I'm me standing at the edge of something huge, and I don't know if I should jump or run in the other direction." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly where Emily was coming from. "I get that. It is a big decision. Emily, it is not just about you anymore. It is about what you want for your life and what you want for this child." Emily looked down at her hands, twisting the mug between her fingers. "I've never thought about being a mother before, and now it is happening. And I don't know if I can be a mother, or if I even want to be. And I don't know if Mark and I can make this work. What if we can..." There it was, the fear that had been lurking beneath the surface, the fear that had been nagging her for days. She wasn't ready to be a mother. She wasn't ready for the kind of commitment that came with raising a child. And the idea of raising that child with Mark, someone she barely knew, someone whose life was as complicated as hers, felt impossible. Sarah's voice broke through her swirling thoughts. "It is okay to be scared. I think you've got a lot more on your plate than you've let yourself admit. But, Emily, you need to think about what you want, not just what Mark wants, not just what your job demands. You've got to ask yourself, what kind of life do you want? What kind of mother do you want to be? And do you want to build a life with Mark? Or do you want to do this on your own?" Her words cut through the fog of Emily's mind. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to think about those questions. Really think about them. What did she want? What kind of life did she want to build? Not just for herself, but for her child. "I don't know," Emily admitted, a knot tightening in her chest. "I've been so focused on everything else, on the pregnancy, on Mark, on my job, that I haven't thought about what I want. I've just been reacting." Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached over, placing a hand gently on Emily's. It's okay. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time. But listen to me. Don't lose yourself in the process. This is your life, your future, your child. No matter what, you've got to think about you too." Emily let out a shaky breath, her heart still racing. "I don't know if I can do this." "You're stronger than you think," Sarah said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "You've always been strong. And no matter what you decide, I'll be here. I am not going anywhere." Emily met Sarah's gaze, and for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how everything would turn out. But maybe, just maybe, she could do this. She looked down at her stomach, placing a hand over it, as though reassuring herself. "I just need to figure out what comes next." "You will," Sarah said, squeezing her hand. "One step at a time." Every meeting with Mark felt heavier now. The tension between them was palpable, as if the space between them was growing with each passing day. Emily could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the silence that stretched between their words, in the way he avoided certain topics altogether. She had never been good at reading people, but with Mark, it was different. She felt the shift as though it were a physical force, something she couldn't avoid or pretend didn't exist, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. At first, she had hoped it was just her imagination, her nerves getting the best of her, but the more time passed, the more she couldn't ignore it. When Mark spoke to her, he was still professional, still efficient. But there was a coldness now, a barrier she hadn't noticed before. He was always polite, always respectful, but it was as if there was an invisible wall between them that hadn't been there just a few weeks ago. They used to be able to talk about anything. He had listened to her ideas, praised her work, and even shared a laugh or two during meetings. But now, their conversations felt like mere transactions. He'd hand her a report without a word, and when he did speak, it was always about the work, never about anything personal, never about what was happening between them. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had tried to tell herself it was normal, that he was just adjusting to the new dynamics between them. After all, it wasn't every day that your secretary becomes pregnant with your child. But as the days passed, her doubts only deepened. Mark S.'s behavior was increasingly erratic. He would look at her with those piercing blue eyes, but there was something distant in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. He had been kind, supportive even, when they first discussed the pregnancy, but now it felt like he was avoiding the subject entirely. It was as though he was pretending it wasn't there, as though their past conversation had never happened. She tried to bring it up once, tentatively, during a meeting. "Mark," she had said, her voice careful, "have you thought more about us, about the baby?" But he had quickly redirected the conversation, his face masked in that unreadable expression she had come to recognize. "Let us stick to the report for now. Emily, we'll talk about that later." Later. She had heard those words before, and every time they came from his lips, it felt like a door was being closed. Emily tried not to take it personally. She really did. She told herself it was just his way of dealing with things, that he was probably just as scared as she was, maybe even more so. But with each passing day, the distance between them grew. She could feel it every time she walked into his office, every time he avoided her gaze, every time they spoke in those cold, businesslike tones. The things left unsaid seemed to fill the space between them, suffocating the air. One afternoon, during another meeting, Emily noticed how distant Mark had become. She was presenting a new set of projections, but his attention seemed elsewhere. He was looking at the paper in front of him, his lips pressed into a thin line, his brow furrowed. She finished speaking, waiting for his response, but instead of the usual constructive feedback, he simply nodded. "Good work," he said. That was all. No elaboration, no encouragement, nothing like the praise he used to give. She felt a knot form in her stomach. It wasn't just the lack of feedback. It was the way he seemed to be shutting her out, the way he was treating her like just another colleague instead of the woman who was carrying his child. Later that day, they were alone in the conference room, finishing up some final details when Mark suddenly spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Emily," he said, turning toward her, his eyes still unreadable, "we need to discuss the next steps." She looked at him, trying to gauge his expression, but his face was as stoic as ever. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about the implications of this, of everything that is happening. We'll need to figure out how we're going to keep this private. We can't afford to let this affect the company's image. You know," the words hit Emily like a slap in the face. The coldness in his voice was like a punch to her gut. Keep this private. Was he really asking her to hide the truth? To pretend that what was happening between them, this life they had created, was something to be kept in the shadows? Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could he ask that of her? How could he be more concerned about the company's image than the reality of their situation? She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do that. I can pretend like this isn't happening. It said my life, and it said our child. I'm in not some secret." The silence between them stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Mark didn't immediately respond, but Emily could see the tension building in his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists on the table. "I understand your concern," he finally said, his voice clipped. "But we need to protect ourselves. You know as well as I do how much damage rumors could do to both of us, especially to me." To the company, Emily's chest tightened at his words. He wasn't seeing her, not really. He wasn't seeing the person who was carrying his child, who was trying to make sense of everything. He was seeing the business, the image he had carefully constructed, and everything else seemed secondary. "You don't have to protect me," Emily said, her voice quieter now, but full of determination. "I am not asking you to do that, but I want to hide who I am. Not anymore." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a tension neither of them knew how to resolve. Mark seemed to hesitate, but only for a moment. He looked away, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on something distant. "I'll need time to think about this," he said, his voice cold, final. "We'll talk later." As she left the room, her heart felt heavy. The silence between them louder than ever. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were at a crossroads, one where nothing would ever be the same again. Emily couldn't ignore the growing tension between them anymore. Something had shifted, something deeper than just the logistics of their situation. The distance between them wasn't just about the baby, or the future, or even the company. It was about their relationship. And Emily wasn't sure if she could live with it any longer. She needed to talk to Mark. She needed to fix this before it drove them both apart for good. But could she really get through to him? Emily took a deep breath before walking into Mark's office. She knew this conversation would determine everything. There was no turning back now. As she stood outside the door, her hand resting on the cool brass handle, she felt a wave of anxiety sweep over her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the weight of the decision she was about to confront. She had let too many things go unsaid, buried too many feelings. But this time, there could be no more silence. She had to face him, face the truth. The door clicked softly as she pushed it open, and Mark looked up from the papers scattered across his desk. His expression was unreadable, but she saw the familiar tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. He was always in control, always so composed. But today, she could sense the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Emily," he said, his voice low, acknowledging her presence. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." But Emily remained standing, her feet planted firmly on the ground. She couldn't sit this time. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. There were too many things left unsaid between them, too many questions that needed to be answered. "No," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to say something first." Mark's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He simply watched her, waiting for her to speak. His gaze was intense, but there was a hesitation in it, something that made her realize he wasn't as sure of himself as he liked to appear. "I can keep pretending that everything is fine." "Mark," she continued, her words coming faster now, as if they had been building up for weeks. "I can keep pretending that this," she gestured between them, "isn't happening. I can pretend that you and I are just going to go on like everything is normal. We have a baby on the way. This isn't some mistake that we can just ignore or sweep under the rug. This is real, and we need to deal with it. Now." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Mark's expression remained unreadable, but Emily could see the shift in his eyes. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crack. "I know it is real," Mark finally said, his voice softer than before, but still guarded. "I've never said otherwise." Emily's chest tightened at his words. She could hear the words, but she didn't feel the sincerity behind them, not the way she needed to. "Then why have you been avoiding me?" she asked, her voice shaking now, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why have you been so distant? Why won't you talk about this? About the baby, about us?" Mark's eyes darkened, and for the first time since they had begun this conversation, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He stepped toward her, his hands sliding into the pockets of his trousers, the tension in his posture palpable. "I'm not avoiding you," he said, though his tone didn't quite match the words. "I am trying to think, trying to figure out what this means, what it means for me, for my life, for this company. This isn't just about you and me anymore. Emily, this is a lot more complicated than you were letting on." Emily's heart sank. He wasn't avoiding her. He was avoiding the truth. He was avoiding the reality of what was happening between them. And as much as she wanted to be patient, to give him time, she realized she couldn't keep waiting for him to make up his mind. She had waited long enough. "I am not letting anything on, Mark," she said, her voice quieter now, the hurt creeping into her words. But you're not letting anything in, either. You were scared. I get it. But I can live in this in-between place anymore. I can keep wondering if you'll be there. If you'll even acknowledge what we are building here. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked as though he was about to say something that could either end everything or begin a new chapter. But instead, he turned away, walking to the window. His back was to her now, and she could see the way his shoulders were tense, his fists clenched at his sides. I'm not sure what to do. Emily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've spent my entire life building this empire. I've worked for everything I have. I've made sacrifices. And now, with you and the baby, I don't know if I can handle all of it. I don't know if I can open myself up again. I am scared, and I hate that I am scared. Emily stood still, her breath catching in her throat. She could hear the pain in his voice, the vulnerability that he was trying so hard to hide. She knew, in that moment, that he wasn't just scared of the baby or their future together. He was scared of losing everything he had worked for, everything he had built. He was scared of letting go of the control he had so carefully crafted. I understand that you're scared, Emily said, her voice gentle now, the anger in her words replaced by something softer, something that felt more like understanding. But Mark, you can keep running from this. You can keep pretending it's not happening. This baby is real, and so is what we are building. Whether you're ready for it or not, it's happening. And I need you to be honest with me, with yourself. For a long moment, Mark didn't respond. The silence between them stretched, and Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. This was when everything would either break or begin to heal. Finally, Mark turned around, his eyes meeting hers. They were darker now, filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. I want to be there. Emily, he said quietly. I want to be responsible. I want to do the right thing. But I can do this the way you want me to. I can just throw everything away. I can lose everything I've worked for. Emily took a deep breath. I am not asking you to throw anything away. I am not asking you to give up who you are. But I can live a lie, and I can raise a child in a world where everything we are is hidden. Mark, it's not fair to any of us. The room was silent once more, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people finally facing the truth. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They both knew that they would have to confront their fears, their doubts, and the consequences of their choices. But for the first time, they both felt the weight of it, and for the first time, they both knew that they had to face it together. Days passed, and the tension between them began to ease. Emily felt a subtle shift in Mark's behavior, a quiet understanding that neither had expected but both needed. At first, she wasn't sure if she had imagined it, but the more time they spent together, the clearer it became. He was different now, gentler, more open, and surprisingly willing to talk about the future, where before there had been silence, avoidance, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. Now there was a delicate sense of calm. The storm had passed, at least for now, and the space between them, though still fragile, was no longer as suffocating. It was like walking on new ground, still uncertain, still a little unstable, but Emily couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope stir inside her. She had spent weeks questioning everything, wondering if the relationship between her and Mark would ever be anything more than a tangled mess of responsibilities and unspoken fears. But now, there was a shift. Mark had stepped up. He had promised to be there for her and the baby, and for the first time, Emily believed him. He hadn't just made promises, he had started to follow through on them. In the days following their confrontation, he had begun to take more of an active role in their situation. He reached out to her more often, making sure she was okay, offering to handle some of her work-related pressures, and suggesting plans for the future plans that included Emily, the baby, and Somehow, the possibility of them building something together, the cold, professional tone he had used for so long, had begun to soften. And while Emily knew it wasn't perfect, she could sense that he was trying in a way she hadn't expected, and in a way that gave her the space to breathe. One evening, as they both worked late in the office, Mark broke the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Emily," he began, his voice a little more tentative than usual, "I've been thinking about everything, about the baby, about us. I know I've been distant, but that is not how I want to move forward. I am committed to making this work, to supporting you, to supporting us." Emily looked up from the file she was reviewing, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. His eyes met hers, steady and open. She could see that he meant what he said. There was no avoiding the truth now. She had expected a lot of things from Mark, but not this level of vulnerability, not this openness. "I mean, not saying I have all the answers," he continued, his voice softer now, "but I want to do what is right. I want to make sure that you and the baby are taken care of, that your job isn't affected, that our future isn't derailed because of this. We'll figure it out. Together." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax just a little, to believe that maybe things could work out. Maybe they could build something from this. The next day, Mark invited her out to dinner. It wasn't unusual for them to have business dinners, but this invitation felt different. There was no agenda, no meeting to discuss, just the two of them, alone, away from the pressures of work and the overwhelming responsibilities they had both been facing. It felt like a chance to breathe, to start over. When she arrived at the restaurant, Mark was already there, standing near the entrance, a small but genuine smile on his face. For a moment, Emily saw the man she had met all those months ago, the man who had been so charming, so easy to talk to. It felt like a lifetime ago. And yet, something in her chest fluttered at the sight of him. "Hi," she said, walking toward him, her voice light but still unsure. "Hey," Mark replied, stepping forward to greet her. "I am glad you came." They sat down at a quiet corner table, away from the bustling crowd. The dim lighting, the soft hum of the room, made the atmosphere intimate, almost like they were in a world of their own. As the evening unfolded, they talked not about the baby, not about the company, but about life. About what they wanted, about what had brought them to this point. It wasn't the heavy conversation they had been having lately. It was lighter, almost like they were getting to know each other all over again. "I've been thinking," Mark said, his voice quiet but steady, "about what you said last time, about wanting to live a real life, not a lie. And I think you were right. I've spent so much time protecting myself, building this life, that I never thought about what I really wanted, not for myself and not for us." Emily looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She hadn't expected this conversation, not here, not now. But as he spoke, she realized that something had shifted within him. He was no longer the man who had been afraid of letting anyone in. He was beginning to face his own fears, to open up in a way she hadn't thought possible. "I am ready," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "I want to make this work. I want us to build something real, something that it's not just about business or about appearances. I want to be a father to our child, and I want to be with you, Emily, not just as a coworker, not just as someone I've shared a night with, but as someone who matters to me, someone I want to share my life with." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly, so openly. And yet, as he spoke, she realized that the walls between them had finally come down. He wasn't hiding behind his work, his responsibilities, or his fears anymore. He was laying everything out, bare and vulnerable, in front of her. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with emotion. She had wanted to hear this, had needed to hear it, but now that it was out in the open, she felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. "I want that too, Mark," Emily replied, her voice soft but sure. But we are not going to have a fairy tale, are we? There are going to be hard days, and we are going to have to fight for this, for the baby, for us. I know, Mark said, his voice steady. But I am ready to fight. For a moment, the room seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them, sitting in the quiet of their new reality. Emily didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't scared. They would figure it out, one step at a time, together. Weeks passed, and the changes in Emily's life began to feel more real. She hadn't anticipated this shift, but with each passing day, she felt herself adjusting to a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just the pregnancy, though, that, in itself, was a constant reminder of how her world was transforming. It was the deeper change, the growing connection she felt with Mark, the subtle shifts in her routine, and the realization that the life she had once known was no longer her own. It was as if she had stepped into a different version of herself, one that was not only caring for a baby, but also learning to build something new with someone she had once thought of as an untouchable figure, her boss, her co-worker, and now, possibly, her partner. At first, the changes had felt overwhelming. Emily had been uncertain, unsure of how she could possibly balance her job, her relationship with Mark, and the new life growing inside her. But now, things had started to settle into a rhythm, one that, although still new and unfamiliar, felt more natural than she had expected. It was as if she and Mark were slowly figuring out how to navigate this together, day by day. The distance that had once marked their relationship had faded, replaced by something deeper. They were no longer just two people tied together by an unexpected situation. They were becoming partners, building something more. Mark had surprised her in ways she hadn't thought possible. Where once he had been distant and guarded, now he was actively involved. He attended every ultrasound appointment with her, asked thoughtful questions, and even started making plans for their future. There were moments when Emily caught him staring at her with an expression of awe, as though the reality of everything that was happening had just begun to sink in. And each time, she felt a small flutter of hope inside her chest. He was no longer just a distant figure, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He was present physically and emotionally, and Emily had started to believe that. Together, they could make this work. But even as she found comfort in his support, there were still things Emily couldn't ignore. The pressures of the outside world, the scrutiny from colleagues, the whispers behind closed doors were a constant reminder of how much their situation had changed. It wasn't just their personal lives that had shifted. It was the very nature of the way they interacted with the world around them. One evening, as she sat at home, staring at the baby books Mark had insisted on buying for their unborn child, Emily felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had been avoiding this conversation with her family and friends for weeks, afraid of how they would react. It wasn't that she thought they would disapprove. It was more that she didn't know how to explain the complex situation she found herself in. She couldn't just tell them about the pregnancy without addressing Mark's role in it. And even though she had felt the warmth and sincerity in Mark's actions recently, she couldn't shake the fear of what others might think. She picked up the phone and dialed her mother's number, her heart racing as it rang. When her mother picked up, Emily could hear the warmth in her voice, but also the concern that had been growing over the past few weeks. "Emily, sweetheart, how are you doing?" her mother asked, the tenderness in her voice unmistakable. "I am fine, Mom. But there is something I need to tell you," Emily replied, feeling the words press against her chest. "Of course. Honey, what is it?" Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I am pregnant." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Emily could almost hear her mother cease, thoughts racing. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was soft. But there was no judgment, only concern. "Are you okay?" her mother asked. "Is everything all right?" Emily felt a wave of relief flood over her. "Yes. Mom, I am okay, but I didn't want to keep this from you. It has a lot to figure out. I'm not sure what happens next." Her mother sighed. the sound of a deep breath reaching Emily's ears. "You know we'll support you no matter what." "Emily, but I do think you need to figure out what you want, not just for the baby, but for yourself." Emily nodded, though she knew her mother couldn't see her. "I know. I am just scared. Mom, I don't know if I'm ready for all of this." Her mother's voice softened. "None of us ever feel ready, sweetheart, but we figure it out, one day at a time. And you're not alone in this." The words, simple as they were, grounded Emily. She had been so wrapped up in the overwhelming changes in her life that she had forgotten how important it was to lean on the people who cared about her. The weight of their support was something she had been trying to carry alone for far too long. As she ended the call, Emily felt a small sense of relief. She had shared the truth with her mother, and now she could feel the weight of the secret lifting, even if just a little. That evening, Mark came over to her apartment, as he had been doing more often in recent days. They had dinner together, nothing fancy, just takeout from their favorite Thai place. The conversation flowed easily, but Emily could sense the tension in the air. She hadn't told him yet that she had shared the news with her family. It felt like another step forward, one that she hadn't quite been ready to take until now. As they sat together on the couch, Mark looked at her, his eyes serious, yet soft. "How did it go with your mom?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Emily smiled slightly, feeling the vulnerability in his question. "She knows, and she's supportive. She's scared for me, but she's going to help me through this." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I am glad you told her. It is a big step. I am proud of you." Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thanks, Mark. I needed to tell her. And now, I guess I am starting to tell everyone else too. One step at a time." He reached over and took her hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "We'll get through this, Emily, together." But even as they shared that moment of quiet reassurance, Emily couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her chest. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mark had promised to be there, but there were still so many unknowns, so many things they would have to face together, and she still wasn't sure if everything would work out the way they hoped. The next day, things took another turn when the company learned about Emily's pregnancy. She had known the news would get out sooner or later, but when she received a call from HR asking for a meeting, she couldn't help but feel the pressure building inside her. She had worked so hard to earn her place at Rutherford Enterprises, and the last thing she wanted was for her pregnancy to define her, to make her feel like an outsider in the company she had given so much to. As she walked into the meeting, her heart was heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. Would they treat her differently now? Would they see her as a liability? She couldn't know for sure, but she could feel the weight of the judgment in the air. Mark had made it clear that he would support her through this. But what would it mean for their relationship? What would it mean for her career? Emily sat in her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel as she prepared for yet another conversation with her boss. This time, under more public scrutiny than ever before. Her knuckles were white from the tension, and her heart thudded against her ribcage, the sound in her ears louder than the hum of the engine. She had been dreading this moment for days, but now it had arrived, and there was no way out. She hadn't expected it to be like this. When she first found out about the pregnancy, her mind had been consumed with uncertainty. Yes, but there had also been an odd sense of hope. She had been naive to think that hope would be enough to carry her through the complexities of her situation. Now, sitting in the parking lot of Rutherford Enterprises, with a thick fog of tension weighing down her chest, she realized how much more was at stake than just her personal life. Emily knew that the pressure wasn't just coming from inside her, it was coming from every direction. The company, the people she worked with, the ones who had once seen her as an asset. Everything had changed. The whispers, the sideways glances, the unspoken expectations. It was all becoming too much. It wasn't enough that she was pregnant, a situation that was already difficult to navigate. But now, her presence in the company was a potential liability. She could feel the weight of the corporate world's judgment pressing down on her with every step. She wasn't sure how she had let herself get to this point, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it anymore. The call from the CEO had left her with little choice. There was no more pretending that everything was fine, no more hiding behind the work that had once been her comfort zone. Today, she was going to face the consequences of her choices no matter how hard they were. Her phone buzzed in her lap, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a reminder of her meeting, the one that had been set up with the CEO. With a deep breath, she straightened her back, forced her hands to relax on the steering wheel, and turned off the car. The weight of the decision, the moment, felt heavier than any report she had ever prepared or any spreadsheet she had ever presented. As she walked into the building, the world around her felt like it was closing in. The halls, once so familiar, now seemed colder, more sterile. The sound of her heels echoed against the polished floor, each step another reminder of how different everything had become. She could feel the eyes on her, the glances that followed her every move. The whispers were barely hidden now, like a low hum that followed her from room to room. It was as if she was no longer Emily. The ambitious financial analyst, they didn't see her like that anymore. They saw her as a problem, a complication. When she arrived at the CEO's office, the receptionist gave her a small, tight smile and motioned toward the door. Emily nodded, her throat tight with nervousness. She knocked lightly, the sound sharp in the silence, before entering the room. Inside, the CEO was seated behind his desk, his face unreadable. He didn't look up immediately, his fingers drumming against the desk as he sifted through some papers. Emily stood at the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, he looked up. "Emily," he said, his voice steady. But there was a coldness to it now, an edge she hadn't heard before. "Please, sit down." She did, feeling the weight of his gaze on her as he folded his hands in front of him. The atmosphere was thick, filled with an air of formality that she hadn't felt in months. This wasn't the man who had once praised her ideas in meetings, who had once offered words of encouragement after presentations. This was the CEO of a corporation, a man who saw the situation as a business problem no more, no less. "Emily," he began, his tone businesslike, "I've been following your recent situation, and as you know, we need to address it. The fact that you are pregnant and the circumstances surrounding it have begun to cause concern, not just within the company, but externally. We've received some feedback about your upcoming maternity leave and the potential impact on your role here." Emily felt her pulse quicken. "I understand," she said, though her voice trembled, "but I didn't want this to affect my work or my position in the company. I've always been committed to my job, and I will continue to give my best effort." He nodded slowly, his eyes cold as he met hers. "I appreciate your commitment, Emily. However, as you know, the company has a reputation to uphold. Our clients, our partners." He paused, almost as if considering his next words. "They expect a level of professionalism, and this situation your pregnancy has the potential to cause complications. People are talking. It is not just about you anymore." The words hit Emily like a punch to the stomach. She had known that the company would react, but hearing it so bluntly, so coldly, made her heart race with panic. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everything she had worked for was being stripped away. She opened her mouth to respond, but the CEO held up a hand, cutting her off. "Look," he continued, "I am not saying you are not capable. What I am saying is that, in light of all this, I think it would be best if you took a leave of absence, at least for a while. We can find a way to help you transition out of the role temporarily, without it affecting the company's operations." Emily's stomach twisted as she processed his words. He wanted her to leave, to step aside, to fade into the background while they tried to protect the image of the company. The thought made her blood run cold. "Are you asking me to resign?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated, but only for a second. "Not exactly. I think a break, A temporary leave of absence would be the best course of action. After the baby is born, you can come back if you choose to. But for now, this situation is just too volatile. The words were like a slap in the face. Emily couldn't breathe for a moment, the world spinning around her. The idea of stepping away from her career, of giving up everything she had worked so hard for, was unbearable. She had always prided herself on being independent, on carving out a path for herself. And now, everything was slipping away, piece by piece. But as she looked at the CEO, she realized something. She couldn't let this define her. She couldn't let this moment dictate the rest of her life. She wasn't going to stand by and let herself be pushed out of something she had earned. This wasn't just about her job, it was about her future, her dignity, and the future of the child she was carrying. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and met the CEO's gaze. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But I am not giving up. Not yet." As she left the room, her mind was racing. She didn't know what to do yet, but one thing was clear. She couldn't just sit back and let everything fall apart. She had to take control for herself and for her child. Emily's heart raced as she stepped into the conference room. This would be the moment that decided her future, both professionally and personally. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor felt loud in her ears as she crossed the threshold, the weight of the situation heavy on her shoulders. She had spent the past week preparing herself for this mentally, emotionally, but nothing could truly prepare her for the reality of what was about to unfold. The room was large, intimidating. The long conference table was surrounded by high-backed chairs, each one occupied by a director or senior manager, their faces stern, expectant. Emily had been in this room countless times before, but today, everything felt different. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her as she walked toward the seat at the far end of the table. Mark was already there, sitting quietly at the end of the table. His presence was a small comfort to her in the midst of this storm. When their eyes met, he gave her a subtle nod, a silent reassurance that he was here for her, that they were in this together. But even with his support, Emily couldn't shake the nerves that made her stomach twist. The CEO, a tall man with a sharp gaze and even sharper words, was the first to speak as the meeting began. "Emily," he said, his voice as cold as it had been in their previous conversation, "I've heard your side, and I've heard your concerns. But we need to be clear here. This is not just about you. This is about the company, about its image. We have a reputation to uphold." Emily took a deep breath. This was it, the moment to stand her ground. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, she might never get the chance to make her voice heard. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of the directors. There was no turning back now. "I understand that," Emily said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming through her veins. "I understand the company's concerns, but what I don't understand is why my personal situation should be used against me. I've been nothing but professional, and I haven't broken any company policies. I don't believe that my pregnancy, or the fact that I am about to become a mother, should affect my ability to do my job." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see some of the directors exchanging glances, the unease palpable. She wasn't backing down now. She couldn't. This wasn't just about her career. It was about her dignity, her future, and the future of her child. Mark spoke up then, his voice calm but resolute. "I agree with Emily. Her pregnancy doesn't change her abilities or her work ethic. We're in a position where both of us want to balance our careers and our personal lives, and that shouldn't be something that holds her back. This company is about innovation, about progress. We should be encouraging that, not penalizing it." Emily glanced at Mark, grateful for his support. His words felt like a lifeline. As much as she had tried to carry the weight of this alone, having him stand beside her made it all feel a little more manageable. The CEO didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he studied them both. "I understand your point," he said slowly, "but The reality is that we have an image to maintain and public perception, especially with your role as a senior member of this team, matters. Emily didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. I understand the importance of public perception, but I also understand the importance of fairness. And if we were going to maintain this image, then we need to make sure that people are treated fairly, regardless of their gender, their pregnancy, or their personal situation. If I've done my job well up until this point, why should my pregnancy be a reason to question my competence? Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time since the meeting began, the tension seemed to shift. The CEO's eyes narrowed, and he exchanged a few more looks with the other directors. Emily could feel the collective weight of the room pressing in on her, but she held her ground. She was no longer the woman who had walked into the office with no voice. She was someone who had something to fight for, and she wasn't about to back down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the CEO spoke again, his voice quieter this time. You make a strong argument, Emily, and I'm not saying this isn't a difficult situation, but I am saying that we need to consider the overall impact. Mark's voice was firm, unwavering. I've been here long enough to know that we can handle this. We can make it work without compromising the company's integrity. Emily's role is important, and her ability to continue in it is vital to the company's success. We didn't have to sacrifice one for the other. There was a long silence before the CEO finally sighed and leaned forward. All right, he said, his tone more resigned than anything else. You can stay, but this situation needs to be handled carefully. We'll make sure to work around your maternity leave, but you will need to maintain a low profile, no disruptions. Keep your personal life and your professional life separate. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a victory, and Emily felt the weight on her chest lift, even if just a little. She had stood up for herself. She had fought for her future, for her career, and for her child, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief. As she left the conference room, Mark followed her, his footsteps steady and reassuring beside hers. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. You did well, he said quietly, his voice full of pride. Emily didn't know if she was ready to celebrate just yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was back in control. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had won this round, and that was enough for now. But as she walked through the halls of the company, her thoughts returned to the whispers she had felt earlier. She knew that winning the battle didn't mean winning the war. The real test, the true challenge, would come when she had to face her colleagues and when she had to live with the consequences of her decisions. She wasn't naive. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for now, Emily was determined to walk it with her head held high, no longer afraid to take a stand for what she believed in. The hardest part was behind her, but the toughest challenge was yet to come. As Emily sat on the couch, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, she realized that everything she had feared had led her to this moment of clarity. The apartment around her was quiet, a sense of stillness that felt almost foreign after months of running on adrenaline. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the occasional distant sound of traffic outside, it was all so peaceful, so calm. She had been through so much. The uncertainty, the fear of losing her career, the pressure from both her personal life and her job. It had been overwhelming, but as she sat there now, she couldn't help but feel something different. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't anxiety. It was a quiet understanding, a sense of peace. For the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. It had taken a while to get here, but the weight of the past weeks was finally lifting. She no longer felt like she was at war with herself or with the world around her. The battle to keep her job, to prove herself, to navigate her relationship with Mark, those struggles were all part of the process. But they had led her here, to this quiet moment of reflection. Mark had been a constant presence, and she had come to appreciate how much he had stepped up in ways she hadn't expected. Their relationship, while still new and filled with uncertainty, was also beginning to feel more stable. They had their challenges ahead. Of course, parenthood was no small thing, and the dynamics of their personal and professional lives would continue to evolve. But for now, Emily felt confident that they could face whatever came next, together. Mark had shown her a side of himself that she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just the CEO or the man she had briefly encountered at the charity gala. He was becoming someone she could rely on, someone who was genuinely invested in their future. And while the future was still uncertain, she knew that he was as committed to making it work as she was. They weren't perfect, but they were learning, day by day, how to navigate their new reality. Emily looked down at her hand resting on her stomach again, feeling a small flutter, a reminder of the tiny life growing inside her. She smiled softly, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and anticipation. She hadn't expected to be here. She hadn't expected any of this pregnancy, her relationship with Mark, the upheaval in her career. But as she sat there, she realized how much she had grown through it all. She had fought for her place in the world, and she was still standing. The thought of becoming a mother filled her with both excitement and a touch of trepidation. She had always been someone who prided herself on being independent, on carving out a space for herself in the world. But now, everything was changing, and while change was never easy, she felt ready for it. She was no longer afraid of the unknown. She was embracing it. She spent the next few days preparing for the baby. She went through baby clothes, bought items she hadn't even known she needed, and began setting up a small nursery in the spare room. There was a comfort in the routine of it all. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of control. She was doing this one step at a time, and in those small moments of preparation, she felt like she was finally building the life she had always wanted, even if it wasn't the one she had imagined. But life, of course, had a way of throwing curveballs when she least expected them. One afternoon, as Emily was finishing a meeting at work, she received an email from a headhunter she had met a few months ago. She opened it with a sense of curiosity, but when she saw the subject line, "Exciting New Opportunity Senior Executive Position," her stomach flipped. The email was an offer for a position with another company, one that would be a significant step up in her career. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about, one that many people in her industry would kill for. She stared at the email for a long moment, the excitement of the offer quickly mingling with uncertainty. Could she accept this job? The new company was well regarded, and the role would allow her to continue building her career at a higher level. It was the kind of job she had always aspired to, the kind of challenge she had worked so hard for. But there was a complication: her pregnancy, her relationship with Mark, and the life she was now building with him. Emily felt torn. The opportunity was everything she had worked for, but it was also something that would demand a lot of her time and energy. Time and energy that, in a few months, would be diverted toward a baby. Could she balance both? Could she take on a senior role while also being a mother? She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing as she weighed the pros and cons. On one hand, the job would allow her to continue pushing herself, to keep advancing in her career. But on the other hand, it would take her further away from Mark and the family they were trying to build. She didn't want to lose herself in her career, but she also didn't want to lose the chance to achieve something she had worked toward for so long. She glanced at her phone, where a text message from Mark had just come through. "How's your day going? Thinking about you." She smiled at the simple, thoughtful message. Mark had been a steady presence in her life, and his support meant the world to her. He had already made it clear that he was committed to their future together, but she hadn't yet told him about the job offer. She wasn't sure how he would feel about it, how it would impact their dynamic. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a call from her mother. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice light but still filled with the weight of her thoughts. "Hi, honey. I've been thinking about you. How are you doing?" "I am good," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Busy, you know, but everything is going okay." Her mother's voice softened. "I can hear it in your voice. There is something on your mind, isn't there?" Emily hesitated, then told her mother about the job offer. Her mother listened intently, asking questions and offering advice. But in the end, the decision was Emily S. It was her career, her life, and her future that she needed to think about. As they ended the conversation, her mother S words echoed in her mind. You can have both. Emily, just don't forget to make time for yourself. Don't forget that you deserve happiness too. Emily knew her mother was right. This was her life, and she had the power to decide what came next. But as she sat there, contemplating her future, she also knew one thing: whatever choice she made, it was going to be a new beginning, one that would shape her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And for the first time, she felt ready for it. Months later, Emily stood in the nursery, feeling the weight of the future in the air. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about everything they had built together. The walls, once bare and uninviting, were now adorned with soft colors, gentle patterns, and a few cherished items that marked the beginning of a new chapter. The crib, now assembled with loving care, stood at the center of the room, waiting for the baby that would soon fill this space with life and laughter. The rocking chair by the window, the one Mark had picked out with a thoughtful smile on his face, had become a quiet refuge for Emily when she needed a moment to herself. She placed her hand gently on her stomach, now swollen with the life growing inside her. It was strange how much had changed. Just months ago, she had felt uncertain, unsure of how everything would fit together: the baby, her relationship with Mark, her career. The future had seemed so distant, almost unreachable, but now, standing in this room, everything felt different. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to feel that quiet sense of peace that came with knowing they had made it through the hardest parts. She could still remember the day Mark had asked her to move in with him, the way his eyes had softened when he said he wanted to be a part of everything. Back then, she hadn't been sure how they would navigate the complexities of their relationship, how they would balance being colleagues, partners, and parents. But somehow, they had found a way to make it work. They had faced the challenges together, side by side, and now they were standing on the other side stronger, more connected than ever before. Mark's presence had been a constant throughout everything. He was no longer just the CEO she had once feared, nor just the man she had once had a brief encounter with. He had become her partner in every sense of the word. He was there for every ultrasound, every doctor's appointment, and every late-night conversation about their future. He was learning how to be a father, and he was doing it with a tenderness and care that Emily had never imagined possible. She smiled to herself, thinking about how far they had come. There had been moments when she doubted if they could truly make it work, moments when she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, when the demands of work, family, and a growing pregnancy seemed too much to handle. But they had pulled through, and now, here she was, standing in the nursery of their home, surrounded by the quiet hum of anticipation. The baby would be here soon, and with it, a whole new set of challenges, but also a whole new set of joys. She looked up as Mark entered the room, a warm cup of tea in hand. His eyes lit up when he saw her, his smile soft but genuine. Emily could see the change in him, the way he had grown into his role as a father. He was still the driven, focused man who had built a successful company. But there was something softer about him now, something more open, more willing to embrace the messy, unpredictable nature of life. "How's my favorite mother to be?" he asked, his voice filled with affection. Emily chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him. "I am good," she replied, just taking it all in. "It feels real now. You know." Mark nodded, stepping closer and gently wrapping his arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence comforting and steady. "I know. It's crazy how fast it's all happening, but I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." Emily leaned into him, the sound of his heartbeat steady and reassuring. It was moments like this, small moments of connection, that made everything worthwhile. The late nights, the uncertainty, the moments of doubt. It all seemed to fade away when she was with him. Together, they had built something strong, something worth fighting for. "Are you ready for this?" Emily asked softly, turning her head slightly to look at him. Mark smiled down at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and excitement. "I don't think anyone is ever truly ready for parenthood, but I am ready for us to do this. Together." She felt a tear well up in her eye, a mixture of relief and joy. The journey hadn't been easy, but they had made it. And in that moment, standing in the nursery with Mark by her side, Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had made it through the hardest part, and now they were ready for whatever the future would bring. The baby would change everything, of course, but it was the kind of change that felt right, the kind of change that made them both realize how much they were capable of. Emily had always prided herself on being independent, on carving her own path. But she had learned something new. She didn't have to do it alone. She had Mark, and together, they could face anything that came their way. As Emily and Mark stood there, quietly talking about their hopes for the future, she couldn't help but think about how far they had come, the struggles, the challenges they had all brought them here, to this moment. And while she knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, she also knew that they had the strength to navigate it. Later that evening, as Emily sat down to review some work emails, she received a call from the headhunter who had reached out to her months ago, offering the senior position at the other company. The job was still available, and it was an incredible opportunity, one that could potentially elevate her career to new heights. But as she stared at the message, Emily found herself at a crossroads once again. Could she really accept this job offer now, with a baby on the way and a growing family to consider? She didn't know yet, but the thought lingered in her mind. She wasn't ready to make any hasty decisions. She would need time to think, but for now, as she sat in the nursery, surrounded by the warmth of her home and the quiet presence of Mark, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: whatever came next, she was ready. In Emily's journey, we see that life is rarely a straight path. Sometimes, the hardest decisions come unexpectedly, whether it was facing a surprise pregnancy, balancing personal and professional aspirations, or navigating complex relationships. But the real lesson here is that we are all capable of making choices that align with our values and the future we want to create. Emily's strength lies not in her ability to control every outcome, but in her courage to confront uncertainty head-on. For those of us who have lived through many seasons of life, it is easy to forget that the most powerful choice we can make is to embrace change with grace and resilience. Life may present challenges, but with support, honesty, and self-awareness, we can build the future we deserve. It's never too late to take a stand for what matters most. And like Emily, we can find peace in knowing we are doing the best we can with the tools we have. This story reminds us that even in the midst of chaos, we always have the strength to choose love, growth, and authenticity, 3 qualities that never go out of style. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey with Emily. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more meaningful stories that inspire and connect us all. Stay tuned for more, and we look forward to sharing more heartfelt journeys with you soon.